what I understood him to say is not that that's an aspirational goal. What I took it to mean is that that is what's happening right now, that we are now experiencing less racism than we did before. I think that the racism is exactly the same. It just looks different.
I see.
It's James Crow now. Hey, Ange.
Hey, Les, how you doing?
Doing pretty good.
Good. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Black Boomer Besties from Brooklyn. I'm Angela, and that is my best friend of almost 50 years, Leslie. We are two intellectually curious 60-something-year-old Black women, and we are here to invite you to join us in thinking deeply and acting boldly. So, if you are an intellectually curious older woman, or if you love one, or if you want to become one, hang around with us. We're going to be talking about some juicy stuff. But first, let me have Leslie tell you a few things.
So,
you forgot.
No, I don't forget. I feel it so passionately. It has to come up from deep.
Okay,
but
go.
we think you're going to love our podcast. So we would like you to be one of our subscribers. So please press like and subscribe and tell your friends about us too. I think you'll be happy that you did.
All right. So what we're going to be talking about is something that I was enlightened by, and I brought to Leslie's attention. And so I was listening a few months ago, maybe earlier in September. There was an On Point, which is a public NPR radio station
show.
Radio show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a podcast called On Point.
But it's also broadcast. I listen to it on the radio. It's not just a podcast. Yeah.
Okay, groovy. So it's WBUR, and it was in September. Sorry, I don't have the date. We'll put it in the episode notes.
Okay.
And Meghna Chakrabarti was interviewing Coleman Hughes, who's an author, and he had just written a new book. What's the name of his new book? Did I write it down? I don't think I wrote it down.
Anyway,
the name of the episode was "Can Colorblindness Lead to Equality in America?" So I listened to it, and I noticed the way that Meghna was interviewing him, and I noticed how how her questions hit, and then I kind of locked that in, and I was like, wow, that's interesting. I like how that interview went. I did not agree with a lot of the Coleman Hughes's perspectives, but I loved that the questions were answered. Okay. So that was a point of time.
Great interview talk.
Correct.
Boom.
Correct. Noted, right? Interesting. Oh, I'm going to get that book because I'd like to kind of understand him a little bit better.
And I do have the name of the book.
Okay, thank you.
It's called The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America.
Okay. So this is a young Black man. He's in his late 20s who has this perspective. Okay. So as my mother would say, stick a pin there. Then fast forward to early October.
I think it's the second or third.
Right. Ta-Nehisi Coates comes out with his new book called The Message. It depicts his time in South Carolina, in Dakar, Senegal, and in the West Bank, Gaza. And he wrote this book. And then he was interviewed by someone on CBS. And as soon as I heard that interview, how that interview went, I was like, oh my gosh.
I remember this other interview.
And I was like, Les, Les, and of course, you were listening to all of the brouhaha over the interview.
Ta-Nehisi Coates
correct.
Interview.
And so I tied it back to this other one. I'm like, it would be so great for us to compare and contrast the interview, the style, what was, so we are going to be talking about the content of each person's point of view. But we also wanted to talk about the interviewing style, and we'll kind of, so that's the setup. You want to add anything more to it?
Actually, the style of the interview is a bit more of the point that we're discussing than the content itself, because, anybody can find out the content, but the fact that we can compare the two of them, more specifically, what was similar about it, what was different about it, and why one appealed over the other or whatever.
Right. The other part, and that this is where the content comes in, we wanted to also challenge our own thinking because, quite frankly, in one case, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Leslie and I both are more aligned with the way that he sees the world than Coleman Hughes, right? And so we wanted to kind of be honest about to what extent we are either less critical,
perhaps, or
biased of the interviewer because of these differences. And so we really wanted to go deep in this because we are deep thinkers. It's just who we are. And hopefully you're here because you are too. So with all that being said,
I was just thinking, we're deep thinkers and coffee drinkers.
Got my coffee too. What is it? A cup of ambition, 9 to 5. Anyway.
And this is my National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Cool. Excellent. I probably have one of those because it's rare that you have something like that and you don't buy it and send me one. All right. So, Les, let's talk about the most current one. Let's talk about the interview CBS News with Ta-Nehisi Coates and how you felt about that interviewer. So let's just jump in.
Well, the controversy stemmed from the style of interview. I wouldn't even call it an interview. I would almost say that Ta-Nehisi Coates, the author who was invited to speak about the entirety of his book, was attacked by one of 3 interviewers, Tony Dokoupil, I think is his name, who happens to be a converted Jew. And, I should say he converted to Judaism. I think that would be a bit more appropriate to say. And he was critical of Ta-Nehisi's one-sided writing about what he witnessed on the West Bank.
Okay.
So he called him essentially a terrorist. He says, taken out of context, if your name were removed from it, your award-winning names, take away all your awards and credentials. This book could be in the backpack of a terrorist.
Yes. That was actually how the interview began.
Yes.
And it was peppered with you're a smart guy and we're friends and all of that. It was peppered with that. And then
he asked in the interview, so do you think that Israel should not exist?
Have the right.
That's important. To exist.
You think Israel does not have the right to exist. Yes.
And it went a little bit on and on from there. What was also interesting about the interview was that Ta-Nehisi did not seem to be taken aback from it. Everyone in the audience and around was clutching our pearls. Yet he's a very seemingly low-key guy, and he was just answering. And later he said that he actually anticipated this type of questioning. And I almost thought it was like he was blindsided, in my opinion, or I would have been blindsided, because it didn't appear that Tony Dokoupil was asking him about his book per se, but more about Ta-Nehisi's personal feelings,
his political,
and political leanings, rather than discussing the content of this book.
Right.
Remember, the author visited 3 places and wrote about his experiences in each of these places as a message to his students. He's a professor at Howard University, and none of the other places came up. That's one. But in addition to that, none of the other interviewers had an opportunity to even get one question in of the author. And they mentioned specifically that Gayle King had spoken to him prior to airing that day and had a whole page full of notes and questions that she wanted to speak to him about on air and didn't get the opportunity to do that.
So since this is a compare and contrast, let me give you like some things that I noted that were different that Meghna Chakrabarti language that she used. And I think her questions were just as what's the word? I'm going to say biting, because they were just as challenging.
Okay.
I think, right?
Yeah,
so,
they were pretty deep.
Exactly. But she grounded her questions in things like, tell me more about, right? She said, is it not possible that, things like that.
Pardon me.
What had you meant by XYZ? So for me, that
she said, let me push back a little bit.
Exactly.
Now.
That is kind of respectful. That is curious. That is also good interviewing, good journalism, where you're not kind of bringing, I'm not sure. Even if she had a point of view, by approaching Coleman Hughes in this way, I think she showed him a great deal of respect, and it was a dialogue, not an attack.
I agree.
Right? I think that what Ta-Nehisi Coates experienced was an attack. I mean, in any of because any of the questions were around, so he talked about, as you said, does Israel have the right to exist? This being something that almost like, I thought about Mao and the Red Book, that all of his followers had this red book of rules that they follow, or any kind of Marxist manifesto, that is kind of the way that he was comparing Ta-Nehisi Coates's book in that style, which clearly shows the bias and the kind of intentionality, I think, of the interviewer in that case. So I'll say too that in both cases, I think you, Les, would agree, we were so informed because the questions were asked, right? We got new language, for example, for talking about a way that you can look at an issue that we might not otherwise have considered.
Right.
For example,
I mean, you know me, I'm the first one to want to hear 2 sides of something. I'm very,
much to my chagrin sometimes. Much is like, because Les, no, but I don't.
Did you think about?
I don't. That doesn't make sense to me. Leslie is not a default.
No.
Leslie's not a difficult
I like
kind
to
of
hear
person.
both sides. I'm like, well, consider this. People call me a
Right,
contrarian for that reason. And it's not. There are
It's
other
just-
things to consider. You can't
just have
lock
a lot
in
of
on
whys.
one thing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
Let
but
me
go
give
ahead.
Let me give you an example of what I mean by that, just to be clear. So, one of the things that was asked of Ta-Nehisi Coates was, well, doesn't Israel have the right to exist? And his response to that is, no country has a right per se. Every
Inherent
country was
right.
has an inherent right. Every country was created. The boundaries of every country was created by
force.
By force,
much like
right?
the United States.
Exactly. And so this way of this is a question that's asked every time. Doesn't Israel have a right to exist? The right to exist? And it's like, of course they do. Of course they do. And the interviewer actually said, shouldn't we all kind of have a safe place to be? This is a safe place for Jewish people.
Yeah.
And so hearing this response to that question gave the listener a way to respond to this very kind of common question that we have around Israel's right to exist, almost something that can never be under scrutiny. He gave us language to see it in a different way.
In a different way and discuss it. I'll tell you why you and I differed about this. The criticism of this interview was that I thought the interviewer asked poignant, interesting questions, and they elicited really thoughtful, intelligent answers from Ta-Nehisi Coates. The problem I have, though, is that at one point I wanted to say, are they still talking about this book?
Oh, right.
It's like, am I right now on Fox News, or am I on CNN, or am I on the BBC, World Channel? Are we now discussing the politics of the Middle East? What am I looking at right now? So I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates could well stand up to the scrutiny of having a separate conversation about some of the politics in the Middle East as he saw it on his recent trip, and some of the thoughts that he's put together as a result of it.
Right.
But if in fact he was there to discuss the writing of his book, he was not able to achieve that purpose.
Right. The book as a whole versus this particular
chapter
of the book. Yeah.
So, much like if someone felt passionately about some goings on in Dakar, Senegal, one of the other three places that he wrote about, and spent that time talking about the politics or a particular issue in that country, yet and still we would not get to the essence of the book and the meat of the book. I have no idea from that interview why he linked those three places of all the places, or the connection that they held, or, I don't know. I don't know.
Right. And you listened to the full interview, and we still
I did.
don't know.
No, I don't know.
So what did you think about the On Point interview in terms of the content? Because some people believe that find it really hard to separate their opinion about a topic from whether the persons involved were treated fairly or not, right? If I disagree with you, I don't
Yeah.
give a shit how
Then
you're
it's
treated.
like, yeah,
If
yeah,
I agree
yeah.
with you, then I care. And so we're not wired that way.
No, I was just going to say that's not me at all. Maybe that's the humanist part of me.
Right,
but no, I think everybody has a voice, and I absolutely don't need to agree with their voice. In this case, with this young man, first of all, I don't know if you noticed, but as I was listening to the program, I had to Google him. I'm like, how old is this young man? It's like, oh, no wonder he's thinking, in my opinion, in such a limited way. He hasn't lived long enough. He's 28 years old, and he's had a certain amount of experience. But I'm saying to say that we're no longer in, or racism in this country is going down, and we should strive, and we are moving more toward a race-neutral country. I'm like, what country is he talking about? First of all, we have a whole election that is going to be decided in about 3.5 weeks that is predicated, in my opinion, on race. The only reason, and I said this to a colleague not too long ago, you wonder why an educated, experienced a former attorney general, a prosecutor, a governor, a vice president, why is this person, and a senator, why is this person neck and neck and tied with a person with multiple bankruptcies, a history of being the president, 34 felony counts convicted against him and more pending, a divisive person.
Sexual abusive.
Well, he's, not just that, he has led an insurrection after the election. He's a liar. He is not a truth teller. Election denier. He tells you that he is going to be a dictator on day one, and he's going to, I can go on and on and on about I can compare and contrast the two people. And again, when I say, why are these two in a dead heat? I think it's racism and sexism. But I think, unlike Coleman Hughes, I believe that racism covers everything in our country. Sadly, but everything.
So I have a different opinion.
If let me just get back on Kamala's. If Kamala had 34 felony convictions and more indictments pending.
If she had half.
And more indictments pending, how would the race look? I'm not going to offer a prediction. Just think about it.
Just dropping that out there.
Like? What would the race look like? Anyway, yeah.
So what I thought about his perspective is, this is really provocative. I want to know more. I want to...
You said you're going to get his book.
Yeah, I am. And I'm looking forward to reading it and understanding, because I think, much like I know you do, that's why it's I love kind of the way that we come at things very differently sometimes. I think that some of the points that he made, although they might have seemed Pollyanna-ish, it's also
naive.
I wouldn't use that word. That would be your word, because I didn't see it that way. I thought I listened to him in a very similar way that I listened to Ta-Nehisi Coates. I listened to him like, man, this person is a very deep thinker. His perspective is different from mine. So I didn't see him as young and naive and haven't lived long enough to experience. I saw him, I listened to the interview as, wow, this is someone who has done a lot of research. The people who have opinions that differ from his, who he is in staunch disagreement with.
He's familiar with their works.
He was very familiar with their works. What is kind of what he can understand about their positions and what he strongly disagrees with. So I loved hearing these things, even though where I sit now in the world, in my experiences, I don't agree with him. But I'm very, very interested in learning more about how these opinions were formed. He talked about, for example, as a young person, being in an environment where wearing an afro and was not anything strange, even though he went to school with in a diverse school. It was not strange to see an afro, and then going to a school where people wearing afros was very uncommon, and people touching his afro and him being very upset by it. He does not see that as racism.
And that's just it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So his interpretation of his experiences were not the way I would interpret those things. The same experience for him, it was not, and for others, it would be.
Sure.
Now, I agree that he's seems to be well educated. Mm-hmm. Seems to have a good pedigree. Mm-hmm. I just think that he's missing out or wearing blinders, and I call it naive. Mm-hmm. Some could say privileged, because he has had somewhat of a privileged upbringing, it seems. Mm-hmm. Where let me just say this. This is really deep. I just thought about that. Mm-hmm. You know how I live in the world. Yeah. I live in the world, I guess you could call it Pollyanna-ish, but yes. I call it unicorns and rainbows, right? This is the way that I live in the world. So I see people, I give folks benefit of the doubt, and I give circumstances and situations the benefit of the doubt as well. Yeah. Which is what gets me in trouble sometimes. They're like, can't you see? Whatever. So obviously, as a Black woman in America, obviously as a Black physician in America, as a Black woman physician in America, I've had my share of bias, racism. I see it from my peers, my colleagues, obviously, and my patients. I've experienced it. But do I really see it? That I have this opinion that I have not experienced much of the racism that many people report, many people in my position report. Mm-hmm. Does that mean I've not experienced it? Or does that mean my interpretation of the experience differs? So yes. In Hughes's case, I posit that because we live in the same world, mm-hmm. because he's a Black man in America, mm-hmm. he has experienced the same amount of racism that you, me, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, and unfortunately Emmett Till has experienced, not in the same ways, obviously. Mm-hmm. But his interpretation of them could have been different. His opportunities have been different. And like me, I choose to either see things in a different way. That doesn't mean that I haven't experienced it and been a victim of it.
So Les, let me ask you this question, right? So you often say that race is a construct, right? Mm-hmm. You state that as fact. You state that as still, as all
I
the ways
believe
that you just kind of defined yourself, like you are those things, black woman, black woman, doctor, all of those things. Yet you believe, you know that race is a construct, right? You adopt that way of thinking much more readily than I do, right? Because I'm like, okay, therefore what? But so if race is a construct, and then here's this person in Coleman Hughes who's saying, well, why are we using this construct to forevermore define ourselves? Why aren't we looking for ways to break away from this construct that we know was put upon us and we know does more harm than good? So why are we being bound by this construct?
If I took that away from his talk, as that was his intention, he and I are in agreement. What I understood him to say is not that that's an aspirational goal. What I took it to mean is that that is what's happening right now, that we are now experiencing less racism than we did before. I think that the racism is exactly the same. It just looks different.
I see.
It's James Crow now.
Right.
It's not. Right? So what I'm saying is that I would love to live in a world where we all get rid of that construct of race and see people for who they are, whatever. But before that can happen, you got to tell everybody. Everybody got to do that. Not just me, not just Hughes.
Right.
So what I am saying is, it's like, yeah, that's a wonderful goal to have, and it's lofty. And Lord, if my great-great-grandchildren can experience that, I'd be a happy person looking down or looking up at them. But
let's go looking down.
Looking
down.
But in all honesty, that's not the reality today. And I don't think that he wrote a book about futurism. The book, what I understood him to be saying is that this is what he sees as happening right now. He mentioned certain experiences and explained that they were not due to racism. They were due to other things happening. Curiosity or this or that. And that I didn't agree with.
Right. So neither of us have read his book, and I'm not sure if you're going to, but I'm definitely going to. And so I do want to be kind of careful about, we are speaking based on what we heard in this interview. And so I don't think anything that has been said is out of line. I just kind of wanted to say that more broadly.
Express our ignorance that we have not read the book. We're just commenting on an interview, on two interviews, actually.
Right, and doing the comparing and contrasting. I do think that in my way of seeing the world and the future, that I would want it. Where do we start? At what point do we start having this conversation about removing race, removing this construct from? Because he in the interview was talking about his pushback on some of the people who are very well known in the anti-racism and affirmative action sphere, that when you build policy based on race, those things are kind of have inherent. If someone is being benefited, then someone is suffering from a deficit. And if we make this policy, then that has longer term implications then. So to me, very interesting. I'm not saying I agree or anything like that, but it's like,
It's almost like, in order for these things, and that's why, racism and bias is such a difficult thing. I mean, there are so many people who wish that it would go away. And I tell you, I've had a colleague that says, I don't see you as a Black person. You know, I wish that could ever be true, you know, but in order for these things to happen, let's just say it would have to be like 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, now everybody, you know, because while there are still people remaining, then there's still suffering going on.
Yeah, I get that. Before we kind of bring this in for close, I wanted to read a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, The Message. And it says, I want to tell you that your oppression will not save you, that being a victim will not enlighten you, and that it can just as easily deceive you. Now, I don't know whether this quote was in the portion of the book that was talking about his experiences in Israel and in Gaza. I assume that it was because they didn't talk in any of the interviews that I listened to, and I did not listen to all of them, but in the one that we're focusing on here, there was no conversation about any other part of his book. So I'm going to just believe that this was in relation to the fact that that many people believe, including Israelis themselves, that when they say not in our name, that they see what the state of Israel, which is very different than the Israeli people, but the state of Israel, a right-wing government, that what they're doing is a form of oppression that they can do now in a place of power, that when the history of the Jewish people, they were the oppressed. And so the point here is that kind of we, including Black people, and I kind of want to say this, right? In the same way that I don't like this Black excellence type of trope. My thing is, we're people. We do amazing things. We do disgusting things. We do all the things. There's no exceptionalism in our oppression. We don't. And so his caution, I think, is when you kind of build your whole life around, oh, I'm oppressed, it's not going to save you, because it can become the thing that...
And you cannot use that history of oppression to then become
the oppressor. Right, because here's the thing. It's kind of like, oh, well, you can't... You have to see me through my oppression, and so you can't judge me. You can't judge what I do, because I'm the oppressed. And there's a lyric in one of Bob Marley's songs, and I believe it's Old Testament, because a lot of his lyrics come from the Old Testament of the Bible. It says, every man thinks that his burden is the heaviest. And so this idea, every man's thinking that his burden is the heaviest. And this idea that, you know, because we see it in our community too, this idea that, but, you know, the LGBTQIA community, they can change up whenever they want. This is just, but being Black, we can't take off our skin. And it's kind of like this, but we get the right to be bullied sometimes, because you know what I mean? And it's like,
were bullied, and look at us, and then it's
right, and it's like,
now,
well, you're othering other people. Don't you remember what that feels like? Why would you be okay with having other people feel less than, just because you think that the burden of being Black is the worst thing possible? So I wanted to kind of call that out, because that's always this interesting concept for me. And that is why I'm so interested in listening to more of Coleman Hughes's perspective, because I want to challenge myself around this idea of the burden of being Black, and how that, you know, what are some ways that burden is not something that I have to carry at some point.
Yeah.
in my future.
How about if we move out of this country?
That too. Exodus Summit is coming up.
Another century. You know, again, I say it's aspirational. It would be wonderful, you know, and me, Miss Unicorn, Rainbow Lady. It's like, you know, but that's Afrofuturism for real.
That's hilarious.
You know,
that's hilarious.
It's like
hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Les. Listen, this was long. How long been going on? It's for a while, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to know. I don't want to know. All right, let's bring it in for a landing.
Well, you are something else. That's all I can say. You are something else. And
You'd have it no other way,
guys. This has been another episode of Black Boomer Besties from Brooklyn.
Brooklyn.